better. Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to this panel, Crypto Wars Reloaded, Privacy Technologies, Cybersecurity Governance and Government Access to Data. It's a very timely session, not least due to the UK Prime Minister's recent comments about wanting to ensure no safe space with communications for terrorists, coined as plans to ban encryption. The talks between President Obama and the UK PM last week on this topic, and also on improving cybersecurity, and the EU counterterrorism coordinator publishing a couple of days ago that the EU Commission should be invited to explore rules obliging internet and telecommunications companies in the EU to provide under certain conditions access to communications. There's been more uptake in the use of software to keep internet users anonymous, particularly post-Snowden, with Tor and PGP encryption. And telecommunications and internet companies are also backing privacy-enhancing technologies to show that they're affording absolute privacy to their customers. As Jamie Bartlett from think tank Demos recently said, we appear to be entering a second crypto war. And on that note, I'm very honoured to introduce a hugely experienced, talented and interesting panel. So first of all, we have the moderator, Seda Gürses, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Information Law Institute at New York University. Seda's working on privacy, security, surveillance studies and requirements engineering. We've got Luc Beirens, who's an internationally renowned cybercrime expert, responsible for cyber forensics and incident response, intelligence and exercises at Deloitte. And previously, Luc spent 32 years in law enforcement. We have Phil Zimmermann, wow, the creator of PGP, the most widely used email encryption software in the world. And he was recently inducted into the Cybersecurity Hall of Fame and Foreign Policy's Leading Global Thinkers of 2014. We have we have Ian Brown, who stepped in at the last minute. Thank you very much, Ian, who's Professor of Information Security and Privacy at the University of Oxford. His research is focused on surveillance, privacy-enhancing technologies, and internet regulation. And last but by no means least, we have Bart Preneel, who's a professor at Leuven University and president of the International Association of Cryptologic Research. So my role today is to just keep time, and I shall be doing so ferociously. And I will now pass over to Seda to start the panel.
Thank you, Jo, for that great introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming here, and also to all our valuable panelists. We thought we'd start with very short introductions from each of our panelists to position themselves with respect to where they see encryption and its role for privacy and trust in online services.
Okay, good morning. I'm working at Deloitte, but only since a few months. I was 32 years at the police, and of which 25 years in cybercrime combating, and also a little bit responsible for the communications between government and telecom operators. So, of course, today I'm in, and there's the crypto paradox I wanted to point at, in a difficult, I won't say a difficult position, I always have been in a difficult position. At the one hand, combating cybercrime is also bringing companies to using encryption and better ways to protect their environment. So encryption is one of the topics on that. And on the other hand, doing cyber forensics, which was also a part of my job. Yeah, there you have to go and get into the data of the criminals you are investigating in. So at the one side, you say, okay, we need this encryption to protect society and to have companies better protect the data of their customers or employees. And at the other side, I was wanting to have access to the same data, but if it's protected and there is no cooperation, then you are in a difficult position. And another paradox is, the more you're going to enforce encryption tools, the further you will force law enforcement and intelligence services to introduce themselves into your privacy. because they want to get to the data they need for doing this combating of cybercrime, terrorism, and all the other kind of criminality.
Yeah. So, a few years ago, I had the occasion to go speak at a conference in Bogota, Colombia, and while I was there, they wanted me to speak to some member of their parliament about changing the laws in Colombia to allow strong encryption to be used, because their legal climate at that time prohibited strong encryption to be used, which means that all the banks were open to bank robbers who would electronically get into the bank and steal money. And so as we were preparing for our meeting with this member of their parliament, one of the people that had organized this event was late to the meeting because her bank account had been cleaned out that very morning by bank robbers because of the lack of strong encryption, because the banks were prevented from using strong encryption because it was not legal. And that's the kind of world you live in when the government tries to prevent you from using strong encryption. So, as we see now all this talk about, we're seeing complaints from James Comey and the new director of GCHQ and David Cameron, and now Obama complaining about strong encryption. What is the alternative? It's so entrenched in our economies that we all depend on it now. I don't think it's feasible to try to roll it back. But anyway, I don't know if I was supposed to introduce myself or talk about the issues, but yeah, I guess we should pass it over to Bart.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everybody. So I'm a crypto techie, but not a real techie because I'm not a real professor. I'm not yet on Twitter. But I think it's clear that encryption has become essential to protect our society, protect both data and metadata. And I think the idea that we should have backdoors in it or disallow it, I think is just outrageous. It's of such stupidity that it's kind of unimaginable that politicians take this point of view. It's of course a very appealing standpoint that may resonate with some part of the public, but it really makes no sense. What we need is strong crypto, which is open crypto, which we can review in open way and all but in open way, and which is standardized, so everybody can use it in an easy way. And it's the only way we can protect our personal data, our companies, and our governments. And I'm very intrigued by the title of this panel, that the crypto wars have restarted, or these claims. I think they actually never went away. And our opponents were very smart because we thought we won them by defeating the Clipper chip more than 20 years ago. But in fact, we lost the battle because what happened was governments used security letters to ask for the keys behind our backs. And so we were very happy that there was no Clipper chip, but in fact, we lost the crypto war there. Governments were undermining cryptographic standards and putting backdoors in those. And then finally, if they couldn't break the crypto, they were hacking the end systems and getting the data there. So I think we've been very naive as a community. We thought we won the war, but in fact, we've been losing it, and we have to fight back.
I agree with Bart, and also with Phil. Actually, bizarrely, this seems an ancient debate, even to me. Never mind to Phil. The thing that got me into this whole world 20 years ago, I was such a geeky teenager that when I read about Phil being pursued through the U.S. courts for writing PGP, I found this so amazing and such an incredible idea that it really got me interested in cryptography policy, and I've been working on it ever since. And so I feel slightly weary that this seems to be not just David Cameron making an off-the-cuff remark or even a planned but populist bit of rhetoric immediately post the Paris shootings. It does seem to be a bit more coordinated than that. We just saw, you might have seen on Twitter this morning, State Watch publishing a leaked document from the Council of the EU showing that Guy de Kerkhove, who's the counter-terrorism coordinator for the Council, has proposed controls on encryption, or at least powers for member states to demand decryption keys from operators where they have those. I think Bart is absolutely right that we were naive to think Crypto War 1 was won clearly and decisively. Clearly there was a lot going on behind the scenes. Of course, one of the reasons the Snowden revelations were so damaging from a national security agency perspective is some of the ways that they went about that we now know about, and there are ways to address some of those at least. I don't think NIST will be trusted on cryptographic algorithms for some time. The US National Institute of Standards and Technology that we know was part of weakening one of the key cryptographic protocols that's decreasingly in use, of course, because people are disabling it from their software. And I think bodies like the Internet Engineering Task Force, which it's the body that sets internet standards and which has really decisively said, you know, we don't think this should be happening. We think it's very bad for the security and safety of the internet. So I think it's bodies like that in future will be improving these standards and at least taking out some of these backdoors. I completely agree that targeted hacking will assume yet more of a role.
Okay, thank you everyone for that introduction. Luke, I want to pick up on your point. You said there are two paradoxes, and one of them, you said more enforcement of crypto, the more intrusion into privacy will follow. Are you suggesting that if we didn't have crypto, that law enforcement and intelligence agencies would listen less to our communications?
Of course not. Yeah, they would do, and they did in the past. And don't forget that. And I'm perhaps a little bit too much with my cap of law enforcement or old law enforcement. Let's say at the end of the 90s and all over the beginning of the first decade of 2000, law enforcement used surveillance of telecommunications and the data to I think in 90% of the cases, this gave crucial evidence or leads to the criminals, and that enabled us to bring people to court. Having no longer access to the content of the communications makes it, of course, very difficult for law enforcement today to find a new way to be able to know what the criminals are doing. Before the telecommunications, they could do physical observation because people didn't have the possibility to, on a very long distance, to talk to each other. And now with these communications, they don't know anymore what is being said. So they are looking for new ways to know what is happening in the world.
But it's very interesting because, if anything, there's more data on our communications and our lives than ever before, and law enforcement and intelligence agencies, in that sense, has more access to data than ever before. So why is it that exactly this information feels not available right now?
It's especially the real-time communications which are so important. What people say to each other is important for these law enforcement communities. And so from the moment the communication has ended and they didn't have the possibility to get access to the content, and it's very difficult. It's not so much of course it's also the stored data that is important for the law enforcement, but they are trying to get access to what is said at the moment that it is said.
Bart, we were discussing earlier that you thought that actually this would not be an obstacle, that if they did have suspicion and wanted to access the information, encryption would not be a problem. What do you say about this?
I think definitely they have much more information available, and I mean, of course, the debate is not about content, it's also metadata. I think there may well be real-time access to metadata. We still don't know exactly which information is available to whom. Of course, we learned something from Snowden documents, but we don't know what's happening between law enforcement and intelligence and exactly how the channels work. I also accept that in a country like Belgium, with much smaller budgets, communication and capabilities are much less than in other countries. But I can imagine that definitely, like in case of the Paris attack, that there was a very quick response, maybe help from Anglo-Saxon countries saying, if you give us the phone number of one guy, we'll give you all their metadata, all their machines they've used, the MAC addresses, the IP addresses, all their calls, and all their locations for the past months. This information is available to some governments, in part being supplied by some governments, I believe, and then it's processed and centralized so that when one push of the button, you can get this information. Maybe not real time, but at least very, very quickly. I think the other thing is if you have suspected terrorists or people who should be on a watch list, there is hacking tools. It's very difficult today to have a secure system. All our systems are actually highly insecure, and by accident, it's very difficult to make a secure thing, but also sometimes by design. It's very easy to put an insecure update into a system based on your IP address or your location or the country or whatever, based on a list, and to hack things automatically. So I think for specific targets, it should not be so difficult to just hack the end system and have access there. It's actually very difficult to have oversight on this hacking because it can be limitless and can go very far.
I just want to just get a quick survey here. How many people here come from engineering backgrounds? Okay, and how many people here are from policy backgrounds? So it's kind of an even split. Well, that's, I mean, the intersection of technology and policy has been the story of my life. I think, you know, it's not that, I'm not against the existence of intelligence agencies. I think that the U.S. needs the NSA, the Brits need GCHQ. Every Western democracy has a need for an intelligence agency to provide situational awareness for threats. The problem is that since 9/11, they've kind of gone crazy. And it didn't used to be that way. I mean, we all had cynical suspicions about the NSA. Maybe they were spying on Americans when they weren't supposed to. But, you know, by and large, the NSA didn't spy on Americans before 9/11. But now they do. And that bothers me more than the NSA spying on Europeans because, you know, every country has a foreign intelligence agency of some kind, and, you know, it never would have bothered me if the East German Stasi spied on me in the United States because they couldn't hurt me. They couldn't arrest me in the middle of the night and drag me off somewhere. But if I lived in East Germany, it would matter a great deal to me if the Stasi could spy on me because they can arrest me. It bothers me a great deal that the NSA spies on Americans because it interferes with the apparatus of democracy. Once you build a system like that, you know, some bad government could be elected someday and use the power of the incumbency to maintain power. You know, opposition in China, political opposition in China, is practically non-existent because no one can organize because they live in a panopticon of surveillance. You know, right now the big threat is religious fundamentalist terrorists. But if we build an infrastructure of surveillance like this, of pervasive surveillance, what happens if someday, if some European countries develop parliamentary majorities of those same theocratic elements, and that they control, someday if they ever get in control, what are they going to do when they inherit the apparatus of power of that kind of surveillance? What does a theocracy do when they have total surveillance and total information awareness of its population? You know, it produces an inescapable prison. We can't let this happen. We have to, as a matter of civic hygiene, prevent it from happening. And I used to say that a lot in the 90s, but now it's so much harder. The Snowden revelations vastly exceed the most pessimistic, lurid surveillance fantasies that I wrote about in the 1990s. I extrapolated surveillance in the 1990s and imagined a future where, you know, there would be pervasive surveillance, but it was never as pervasive as what the Snowden revelations have shown us.
Yes, two points. First, of course, Phil is absolutely right that in the mid-90s, it wasn't quite so clear as it is today that we're not just talking about, say, email communications here. We're not even just talking about purely online activities. So many aspects of our lives now are flowing peer-to-peer, but even more frequently through through centralized social media sites like Facebook, and of course with Internet of Things technologies. Even if you're not sitting at a computer tapping away, all sorts of signals will be being sent about your day-to-day activities. So we're no longer even, in quotes, just talking about people's communications, email and so on. We're talking about astonishing moment-to-moment detail of every last aspect of your activities. Everyone you're not just communicating with online, but of course offline as well. That was one of many astonishing Snowden revelations. The fact that they are getting billions of mobile phone location updates every day and then processing those to work out who is spending time physically in the same place, not even electronically communicating with each other. The second point I wanted to make, Phil, you don't even have to imagine semi-autocratic parties coming to power in democracies. Just look at Hungary in the EU today, where there's some very problematic things going on in the Hungarian government. One thing I think, sorry to generalize for the Europeans in the audience, some of you might disagree with me, but I do think there is quite a difference in perspective on the domestic versus foreign issue that you mentioned, Phil. I think it's understandable that many Americans are most concerned about the NSA spying on Americans rather than spying on the rest of the world. I think it's been a useful aspect of the Snowden debate now that we've had a lot more consideration of how far should human rights standards apply to people outside your country, or within your jurisdiction at least, but outside your country. We've had reports from the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights and also the Special Rapporteur on Countering Terrorism while Protecting Human Rights, both of whom strongly point out international human rights law talks about protecting the rights of all of those within your jurisdiction, not just the people within your borders. This is an aspect of international law that the US disputes, but there are very few other countries that interpret it that way. And actually, I think that is the right perspective, even just as a practical matter, because of the very intensive information sharing we know goes on between the intelligence agencies of different countries, not just the Five Eyes, not just the US and its 4 very close allies, but we know they're third parties. There are dozens of countries that are getting a lot of raw intelligence. And even we know from the Der Spiegel stories at the weekend, I love the fourth parties, the NSA snooping on other countries' intelligence agencies, and so getting their take of what they're spying on around the world. So I think a world where we have very strong protections domestically, as much as I do take your point, Phil, that domestic is important because you're protecting the mechanisms for democracy domestically, but I think only focusing on domestic protection is an absolute recipe for a global race to the bottom on privacy protection.
Yeah, I agree, yeah.
I think, can you hear me? Sorry. So I want to follow up on the information sharing. What was different, possibly, Bart, to follow up on what you said during the crypto wars in the 90s, was that there was an alliance created between civil society activists that were fighting for encryption and industry to make encryption available for the masses. What we see now are new cybersecurity agendas, which basically governments asking industry to share information with them. In Europe, this would be under the Network and Information Security Directive. In the US, the proposal is called the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. So basically, we see governments trying to enlist industry in their surveillance programs and information sharing. If this is the case, can we still count on industry as being an ally in fighting for the right to encryption?
I think industry is in a very difficult position here, because I genuinely believe that some companies want to protect our data, and in fact, some US companies claim they have been losing business, cloud business, for example, as a consequence of the revelations, because people don't trust them anymore. So I genuinely believe that they want to do their best. On the other hand, if you look at the government perspective, of course, if you look at the cyber infrastructure, it's not only public infrastructure, it's actually private infrastructure. And so if the private company say, this is our network, you have no information on it. So the government needs the private companies in some sense. But it's not clear where the balance will be. And for example, we know something about security letters. This is something I find very worrying. It means that essentially the US government can tell a US company to do certain things without being allowed to tell about it. So in fact, no matter what companies are claiming in public, you never know what's happening behind the scenes. And so I think companies are in a very difficult position there. And personally, I would I think you have to assume as a user that actually they more or less everything you put in a company in certain country will actually go to the government, and maybe also go to other governments. I think this is makes it very, very difficult.
That's part of the reason why my company moved to Switzerland.
Yes, I think that's something you can do. I think the other thing is this is maybe less applies in the US, but in Europe, if you look at the perspective, what we know from Snowden, I think the Network and Information Security Directive was proposed before the Snowden revelations. So more or less, if you take a very cynical view, it has incident reporting, and you actually have to, so you have to claim when you have incidents, and you have to share vulnerabilities. I mean, imagine you're in country X, which is not the UK, and you now you share your data to your national authority, who then will be sharing it at European level. So actually, if you have an incident or a weakness, it will be reported to GCHQ, who will then start hacking you based on it. And if they can't do it themselves, they will ask help from their US friends. So as a company, which incentive do you have to share your weaknesses, and how can EU impose that actually companies in other countries share their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities with others? So we're in a very difficult position now because there is loss of trust. And without sharing, we can't secure it, but if we share, we will be abused. And this is the conundrum where we end up now. I don't have an answer for it.
I can tell you that based on my conversations with American companies, security people from American companies, that there's a huge betrayal of trust. You know, that they now are feeling very uncooperative with the U.S. government. For me, it was never a problem because, you know, nobody ever asked me to put a backdoor in anything. I think it's because they knew where I stood on that. And by the way, I just want to say that in all the Snowden documents, you know, when they listed all the things that they were able to get into, none of the protocols that I ever designed were on that list. And I like, sorry, I shouldn't. Yeah, right, yeah. Little bragging here, you know. Actually, I was mentioned in one of the Snowden documents back when I first started working on Z-Phone, which is the you know, secure telephony project I started about a decade ago. There was an NSA memo that when they heard me announce that I was working on secure telephony, they said, "This can't be good." And so, and they hadn't even seen it yet. But anyway, the American companies are now in a backlash mode. You know, Google is encrypting the links between their data centers. Yahoo is doing the same. I think Facebook is doing the same. They're all, you know, they make money from this data, but now they're guarding it against the government. And some of the reactions we're now seeing from the intelligence agencies is they're starting to feel the pain of that.
I think this problem of lack of trust brought about by the access to keys, the hacking and so on, is something that really is so damaging to the public and private sector all around the world, including the US, to US technology businesses, that it's something I hope governments, at least the democracies, will have some incentive to move on and try to find some way to get round this difficulty that Bart and Phil have both mentioned now, that on the one hand it's really essential that we are all collectively finding vulnerabilities and fixing them as quickly as possible, but without the concerns about trust that raises. So I already mentioned the IETF, and I do wonder if there's a need for more kind of multi-stakeholder, to use that horrible word, international action, whether it's through the IETF, through existing international institutions, or perhaps through new ones, to enable this kind of thing to happen, both sharing vulnerabilities and fixing them, but also in developing and validating new standards for cryptographic algorithms, for example, that people actually trust. I think there needs to be a lot more thought put into that.
You know, I think that this thing about the standards, like, you know, the random number generator that NIST had, is not as pervasive a problem as you might worry about. That there was only that one random number generator. All the rest of the NIST stuff looked really good, and I would never. Yeah, well, yeah, but nobody that I know would ever use such a stupid random number generator. I mean, the only reason why I think it became important is that NSA paid $10 million to RSA Data Security to put it in their BSafe library, And so that got propagated largely because BSafe had market share because of the RSA patents that expired many years ago, but that's how it became widely deployed. So no cryptographer that I know would use the NIST random number generator in question.
I think I want to comment on this. This is true, and I would be in the same case. But on the other hand, if you were a company and you had your product certified, you better implement it. Because you know what, if you don't implement this one because you don't like it, and then a year later a customer asks for it, right? Then you have to go through the whole process again. So they actually had a hold on companies, and many more implemented than you would suspect, and then who uses it is something else. I want to say something else about standards. You look at backdoors, but what about making standards so complex that nobody understands them, like IPsec? I mean, I don't understand IPsec, and I spent more than 20 years on the mailing list, and I still don't understand much of it, okay? I can teach it to students, but that's it. I would never be able to configure something. And this is actually a victory, right? That if you take somebody who's working 20 years with it, doesn't actually fully understand. It's the same with TLS. It's so complex. And it's not sure that it's our own fault of the techies wanting to keep improving things, or we could actually be incited by some people to make it more complex and come with new requirements, and we actually do this. So there can be other things. One more comment on Phil's thing. I mean, I'm very glad that your stuff is not mentioned, but you should be aware that Snowden had no access to crypto intelligence. He only had SIGINT intelligence. So if they're able to break stuff, they'll probably hide it very carefully, even inside the NSA. So, I mean, we probably trust the things they can't in the documents better than the others, but we still don't know for sure. Don't have capabilities which they only reveal in very restricted cases.
I wanted to add to that, it's not just the complexity in standards. I think another big lesson that the security community has learned since the crypto wars is the complexity in user interfaces is a killer. I think that is the main reason we still, I mean, how many people have sent an encrypted email consciously today? You know, using end-to-end encryption, not just a TLS link to your own SMTP server. So, you know, a small number of an audience that you would think, you know, there can't be many other rooms in the world with so many people interested in this subject. And I suspect, actually. Sorry, that was a bit distracting. I strongly suspect, and many other people have said this, that one of the reasons that we're hearing so much from the UK government in particular now, but some from the US government, is that the usability is improving. We're starting to get apps that people that haven't worked for 20 years in information security are finding it easy to use.
Well, you know, the reason why it's so difficult to encrypt email is because it involves long-term persistent private key pairs that have to have some kind of certificate that has to, you know, it involves trust models. And trust models are very difficult to explain. I've worked a lot on trust models, and it's so hard to explain them. But you can do good crypto without even having any trust models. I mean, right now, I do telephony.
Of course.
And there's no long-term persistent keys there.
Yep.
They're just done just for the session, and your mom could use it. I mean, that's kind of the benchmark. If your mom could use it, then, you know, then it...
I agree.
Now it's usable.
Okay. So it's really lovely that we have a lot of good encryption tools available, but Dimitri Kleiner was recently comparing self-defense using encryption tools to what Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders do. So if there's an acute situation, you can maybe go in and make an intervention, but it doesn't solve the universal health problem. So I think there are two different alleys. One is to individually protect yourself, and this, as we see also in this room, is available to a few people. The other one is to include encryption in internet standards and make it available by default. Now, this is very difficult if there's an attack on standards bodies, on communities of researchers, which are divided between open research and closed research. And also where we saw some failures are in open code review, which we thought would provide us with more more secure software. Where do we see future best practices for this community, and how can we be less naive, as Bart said early in the beginning?
Well, I think today we have no end-to-end secure, easy-to-use, secure by default solution, right? I mean, the product which I use, or the solution I use a lot, is Skype. it actually has end-to-end security, but I'm quite sure it has a backdoor. And we don't have the protocols, we don't see the source code, there is no review. And I think if there would not be a backdoor, probably would not be so widely used, would not be tolerated.
Well,
So I did a count. At some moment, I think, so when I started doing crypto in the 80s, there were probably in the world less than 1 million crypto devices. Now we have about 30 to 40 billion crypto devices, or crypto units in our phones, in our laptops. It's actually everywhere. It's used for authentication, for code updates and so on, this is fine. But to protect confidentiality of data, it's only used effectively if it's for media, for movies, in the past for music. There we can do it, but in fact for end-to-end secure communications, we don't have a solution. I know Phil is working on this stuff.
I'm not just
and
working on it.
Yeah,
we
he
have
has it
and
out,
we've
but of course, and I think this is why I provoke him, so he will actually defend this thing.
Yeah.
But at least today, you take the average user who doesn't know about Phil's great products, has no solution available, and I think in that sense governments have succeeded. I mean, your 3G phone has sophisticated crypto, it's not end-to-end. Skype likely has a backdoor. Everything you use for secure communication is not end-to-end and secure, and if it's secure, it's not easy to use, but of course Phil will change the world.
Thanks, Bart. Thanks for that setup. I've been interested in secure telephony for longer than I've been interested in secure email. But at the beginning, nobody had broadband, and the world wasn't ready for any kind of internet telephony, secure or not. So I had to wait, and I just used that time waiting, developing encrypted email. That was PGP. But really, I wanted to do secure telephony, and that's what I have been doing for the past decade. We have a product called Silent Phone. My company is called Silent Circle. I started it 3 years ago with my business partner is a Navy SEAL, and he wanted to have something that military people can talk to their families when they're deployed overseas. And I said, sure, I can help you with that. And so we have a product called Silent Phone that lets you make phone calls that are end-to-end secure, and your mother could use it. There's no persistent keys. You don't have trust models. You don't have certificate authorities. You don't have public key infrastructure. You don't have all the complexity of that. What you have is it feels like making a phone call, and it's end-to-end secure. And it's used by Navy SEALs. It's used by special operations forces in the Five Eyes, Britain, Canada, Australia, the United States. But it's also used by about 20% of Congress. It's used by the White House. It's used by, it's used by companies. It's used by banks, oil companies, airlines.
Right. But Phil, one of the products that you had in Silent Circle, you had to shut down. And it's very difficult to explain to mothers or SEALs or congressmen all of a sudden when their service disappears and all their email with it.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there and what are the kind of pressures that made you move to Switzerland? And that we unfortunately don't have Ott with us for a legal analysis, but we have Gus. Hi, Gus. Would you like to take my seat? Go ahead.
Yeah, I could tell you that more than a year ago, we had encrypted mail service. It was called Silent Mail, and we shut it down abruptly without warning. In fact, what happened is that another company called what was it called? LavaBit. Yeah, they had an encrypted email service, and they had to they decided to shut it down because they had a national security letter that demanded that they hand over certain things, and they had a customer that is the most famous customer they could possibly have. Right, it was right after the Snowden revelations, and they had to pull the plug. They decided to shut down their entire encrypted email service. Well, as soon as that happened, actually, we had been debating shutting down ours, but then when we saw LavaBit shut down and we knew why, we knew we had the same vulnerability and the same incentives that we would soon be hit with the same problem. And so we shut it down abruptly, without warning. All our users suddenly had all of their mail deleted without the possibility of recovery. And so it was a painful experience, but we did it. And it turns out, actually, though, that people respected us more for doing it. because we knew that it was that imminently we would be hit with the same thing, and we had to do what we had to do. And so we don't have encrypted email service.
That this doesn't affect your other services?
Oh, because it's the crypto architecture. You see, with email, you have persistent keys. You have to, it's a different problem. An ephemeral phone call doesn't need any persistent keys. So you could, the keys are only set up at the endpoints for the duration of the call, and then they evaporate.
I want to make 2 comments after I give Phil the nice opportunity for advertising. As an academic, I feel it's my duty to also say something about this. In the 80s, and there was actually a company based in Switzerland which was known to backdoor its encryption devices in Iran. And in fact, it came to the press because a guy wrote a book about it, because he ended up in jail. He was betrayed by the Stasi, and he ended up in jail, and then he was fired by his company, and he wrote a very interesting book about this. So being in Switzerland doesn't give you immunity, or doesn't mean by definition you're pure. Of course, I trust you, Phil, but still, I want to make this point. The second point, which Phil didn't mention, which I think is fair, is that, of course, this cool phone doesn't have 200 apps, right? So you will have to have a phone which is secure, and then another phone which has all the cool apps which are essential for your life. I don't think we know today how to combine the 2 things on one phone. We're working on this, but I guess this is a very hard research problem.
The way it's been done historically is that some companies created phones that are dedicated to make secure calls. They don't do anything else but that. And they're very expensive, like 2,000 or 3,000 euros. But everybody likes to walk around today with smartphones in their pockets that do many other things. And so how do you combine those things? We decided to build a phone of our own based on Android that would be a smartphone and be able to run other things. But we tried to improve the operating system to improve the sandboxing and to protect it from, from malware. And it's called Black Phone. And so Silent Circle has apps you can download for whatever smartphone you have, the iPhone or Android. But it also has a dedicated phone that has a hardened operating system for trying to address the problem you just mentioned.
Just a linked point. I think as well, it's a mistake. I'm not saying anyone here has done this to focus so intensively on solutions that will protect you against personal attention from the NSA and GCHQ, because that is not going to happen. Just practically speaking, if they're interested enough, they will find ways to get information on you individually. Of course, the issue is on what scale can they do that, and even reasonable crypto will vastly increase the costs of large-scale surveillance.
So what I gather from the discussion so far is that it's an upward battle for encryption to be available to the masses for many different reasons. We have the attacks on the standards. We have technology individually being available, but not necessarily to the masses. And we have the breaking of security on devices so that one could go around encryption. So Ott, who was going to join us but couldn't, unfortunately sent in a question and said, is this a smokescreen debate for something which is already happening, which is the undermining of encryption via bull run and programs like that? And I'd like to welcome Gus to our panel by posing this question to him.
Apologies for being late and missing everything that's been said by very smart people. Is it a smokescreen? I think that the people who are dumb enough to introduce these policies actually mean them, but I also think that there's an additional dynamic at play. And speaking to some within the industry who are particularly angry with recent announcements and speeches by heads of intelligence agencies, I think what is actually also going on, and not just instead of what's going on, but what's actually also going on is they're going to be asking service providers to actively monitor their users to identify suspicious activity. And so who behaves on Facebook like a terrorist? And it's what's most interesting about this from a legal perspective is that, well, first of all, we don't believe that Facebook's really going to start encrypting to the point where what's on Facebook is encrypted against Facebook, and Facebook's always going to have the capability of identifying what you're doing on Facebook and who your interactions are with on Facebook. But the idea of suspicious activity being flagged, within our legal systems, the only domains I think that this happens on a proactive basis is in financial sector and at airports, where we do have an understanding of what it is that they're looking for, what is a suspicious activity in a financial, for financial reporting to an intelligence body, such as a financial center, intelligence center. When it comes to airports, we have an understanding of what is suspicious activity at an airport. I don't know what Facebook is going to be told is suspicious activity in accordance with US law, British law, French law, Colombian law, or any laws around the world. And so are they just going to be watching everything and coming up with their own standards of over-reporting in the way that the financial industry over-reports on suspicious activity as well? So that's where I see the policy going on top of the ridiculousness around cryptography.
I want to comment on this, though. You should be aware that the way you authenticate to Facebook and all these other things is using a stupid password, which you all know is insecure. And so they do actually, there was a talk given by Facebook a few weeks ago in London where they explained they do intensive fraud detection and monitoring. And if you log in from a different IP address or different account, they apply other things. So I think in some sense, they already have this capability to monitor their users. They're doing it actively, of course, in this case, to protect users. But I don't think it's for them a great difficulty to do it for others. Whether they should do it is something else. On the key escrow or forbidding encryption, I want to say things we have to distinguish between communication and storage. For communication, I mean, companies, of course, don't want to do this, and they want to use ephemeral keys, so keys that go away, that you never store, that are different every time. For storage, of course, companies need backup keys, because if somebody leaves the organization or drops his smartphone in a puddle, then of course you want the data back at some stage. So there is always a backup. I think their companies will be in a very difficult position because government may ask this. And then the third point, of course, some companies think it's their duty to monitor Facebook usage of their staff, and they actually also themselves buy products to break secure communications. And so, of course, this is risky because then the government come in and say, do it for us too, right?
Yeah, and let's not forget the most, like, everything you say there, it's bad, dangerous. What I think is the extra step is compelling the company to report you as being suspicious. I don't think our legal systems or our accountability systems can make any sense out of that, particularly at a global scale.
Look, almost all the people who are doing crypto at this table said they're really worried that the technology is not enough to protect the communications and the data. Law enforcement seems to think otherwise. Can you explain the discrepancy?
Of course, you've been talking to specialists, and it's a little bit like the people that are working in government departments are no crypto specialists. There are some, of course, and they are hired, but not all law enforcement and intelligence services are capable of hiring or putting those people in place. So very often it is considered as being something very difficult, and for the policemen to understand, and for this intelligence service agents to know exactly what is going on and how to circumvent, and so they are looking for simple solutions. And if you explain it in a simple way and say, if we put in a front door or a back door or whatever door into, then we will have easy access to these things. In most cases, that's easy to understand, and probably people will immediately say, yes, this is what we need, but they don't see the business impact of putting that in place. And I think a lot of companies, especially if you're looking at protection of critical infrastructure, it's not only about privacy, but it's also protecting the infrastructure that needs this encryption. If you allow to put in backdoors like that, it's also making it difficult for this critical infrastructure protection to do the business as they should do. So law enforcement and politicians take it for, if there is an easy way to do it, then there's what they will choose for. And if not, then you will have the experts that say, okay, but we will have, we'll use other means, and that is then in the dark and you don't know about it. So I don't know a real solution neither. I don't have a magic box where I can find solutions. But if what we need is more transparency on what is happening and accountability for what the actions are taken by governments to do this surveillance. And I think if we have a legal framework to do so, I think that's what we should go for, and not make obstruction on everything that is being proposed, but going for, let's say, solutions that are perhaps feasible to verify in a democracy.
So Gus, coming back to some of the work that Privacy International has done, you've been asking for transparency of what companies are doing as well as governments are doing, and you have not been too pleased. Can you tell us a little bit about what the information is that you found out and where you think future steps would be for more accountable government and company practice?
So there's the transparency reports everybody knows about. It's almost like 2008, 2009, in the sense that nothing's really moved on since then, except for the revelation about Yahoo's legal case around disclosure of their orders to compel to produce data. But the type of work we've been doing more recently is because we know we've hit the maximum you're going to get out of transparency reports, because they still don't get into the granularity of types of access and even types of technologies in place. We're running a project in 13 countries in the global south where we're doing investigations to see which companies have been selling what technologies to which governments. And by looking at government procurement, but also even just company press releases, but also actually finding sources, ex-employees or other such related individuals to these surveillance companies, to find out what kinds of capabilities are actually being sold. And it is exactly as you'd expect. It is the national monitoring centers. It is the ability to compromise all the various forms of security on your devices. It is the analytics at a national scale. And getting that information out is particularly hard, because you have to identify authoritatively that this company is operating in country X. And we know that country X now has these capabilities as a result of that. But we have some very we released a report back in November about Central Asia and what kinds of companies are selling there, particularly Israeli companies that are selling monitoring centers and mass interception capabilities. Oddly enough, modeled on the Russian surveillance system, SORM. And we have some reports coming out shortly about Morocco, where a hacking team had been identified as being used against journalist collectives. We have a report coming out in April about Colombia, and again, the types of companies there. And we have a report coming out about Uganda and a lot of the Western technology that ends up there. So these capabilities, such as what Ian's talking about, and I'm sure everybody else has spoken about compromising actual devices or getting access to national scale communications, these technologies are out there. And just one final note on Colombia. We were there just a few months ago, and early indications, although we haven't completely confirmed this, early indications are that their mobile infrastructure is unencrypted. So it'd be interesting to see how many countries actually do use encrypted mobile communications at the moment, and if there is such data out there. So that'd be transparency we'd like to see.
Thank you so much, Gus. I think your work is wonderful, also challenging to those of us who like to make a distinction between democratic and undemocratic states, which I think is sometimes a very flawed distinction. Bart, I'd like to give you the word, but I think I'm going to open now to the public for any further questions. Casper has a question. Do you have, I'll just pass my mic.
Well, actually, I wanted to lob a question to the chair, because the chair has probably the best experience maybe of anybody at CPDP of operating with a regime of a law which can coerce access to decryption keys in respect of intercepted communications. And I thought it might be quite useful to hear the chair's perspective on this.
Thank you, Casper. Appreciate this. Well, I think it's an incredibly difficult area. I think there's been a lot of discussions recently about needing law enforcement and intelligence agencies needing more powers in this area, particularly around encryption and also around metadata or communications data. But what we see at the moment is a lack of actually enforcing the powers that they currently have. So I think until the agencies start to try and enforce the powers that they've got through the courts and see what happens, I don't think there's particularly a case for new powers.
Okay, further questions. And may I ask those who are a little behind, since my cable doesn't reach that far, to come forward?
So often the case has been made that targeted surveillance is preferable to the bulk collection that we've seen. But as Bart made the point earlier, nowadays it may be possible to target vast swathes of people with targeted malware or updates. And so does that now present the same sort of obstacle that it might have presented in the past from targeted surveillance? And also just to add that it seems completely perverse for agencies to have the responsibility to protect the security of the internet while also undermining it. And it seems ridiculous that those aren't separated into independent bodies. That just seems obvious, but it's clearly not.
I think it's very difficult even to define what targeted surveillance is. Right, I think that's the problem. But the problem, of course, is that with these technologies, it's very easy to scale these things. What is hard to scale is the things we've seen announced about a year ago. This TAO. This is if you have to implant devices into routers, physical chips being added. This is limited, right? This you cannot do. They only would buy a few thousands of those. But I think everything which is electronic can be done massively. Also, what people underestimate is the complete control of the network. Even tech experts are surprised by this, but they actually have sensors and also active nodes in the network. And in fact, if you think you're talking from your device to Google, you may well be talking to one of these agencies instead, who then send malware. It can all be automated. But I think this is a very big question. We are struggling with what is targeted surveillance and what is mass surveillance. Define it and then enforce it. And I think indeed with technology, it's going to be very hard. Right? With development technology, very hard to do this actually.
I just want to interject a question there, which is, as technical people, do you think just because somebody is legitimate target that anything goes? Because I think this is one of the discussions that we haven't been having, because it's easy to say no to mass surveillance and then targeted is their job.
Yeah. No, absolutely not. And if you, I think a good place to start in this discussion is, I think it was the 2008, I'm sure the German lawyers in the audience will tell us if I'm misremembering this, constitutional court decision there where the German court said it is so intrusive and invasive to hack somebody's device in this way that really there have to be very high standards before law enforcement agencies go down that route, and they came up with this constitutional right to IT security. And I hope that's something that other countries' courts will consider, because you're right, Seda, that's a really important question.
I want to know if we are asking the right question if we ask if cryptography should be forbidden, because if I look at the analog world, if I talk to someone, I talk in private, and if there is no court order and no one listen in, they cannot go back and look at what I said at this moment. But if there is a clear suspicion, they can bug me, they can listen in to my conversation. Okay, they have the risk of getting identified if they plant the bug or something like this. But I think where do they have the right, just because it is digital, to look at every private communication that I have with someone that is outside? My question is this the way it is?
You know, I look at that as I kind of make a distinction between their ability to target a particular target. You know, we're accustomed to having law enforcement be able to go in and target a single individual. What we don't want is them doing like the driftnet phishing approach, where they just get everything. the reason why we make that distinction is because we know that it takes a certain amount of work for them to target a single individual. They have to pay people to do it. They need to go and physically go there and do something. But if you just intercept everything, it becomes frictionless. It becomes, you know, asymptotically smaller cost. Whenever you have something be frictionless, strange things happen. You know, like the postal mail costs money. You have to buy stamps and put them on envelopes. And so when you go out to your postal mailbox, there's a finite amount of mail you're going to see in your postal mailbox because somebody had to buy stamps to send you spam. You know, you might get some spam, but you're not going to get, you know, 12,000 spam messages a day in your postal mailbox. It would be too expensive. But because email is frictionless and cost-free, then we get these crazy, you know, emergent behaviors out of the system where you get, you know, 98% of all the email is spam. So when you take the cost of criminal investigations and drop it to nearly zero, not the cost of the whole investigation, but just the cost of the police being able to see things. When that cost drops to zero because they have pervasive automated surveillance, then the job of policing changes. You know, it becomes too easy, too frictionless, it can slide effortlessly into a police state. And it's the friction that police requires a certain amount of elbow grease, some effort, some force times distance, work to get law enforcement done, that has more, that keeps us away from being a police state more than the Constitution. When that becomes frictionless, you know, when the police job becomes too easy, then it becomes easier to slide into a police state.
Here you go. Sorry about that. Stephanie Perrin, University of Toronto. I would just like to say this is kind of deja vu, having gone through this in the 90s, but there are quite a few differences in the discourse today than there was back then. Phil didn't talk about, for those who weren't around, the length of time he spent under a grand jury indictment, unable to travel and all the rest of it. That was a fun time back then. Maybe the same thing would have happened if you hadn't dropped your program there for the secure mail. Who knows? My question is really about the gulf in trust that is opening up with the revelations, not just the Snowden, but of course this new debate on whether we have a right to encryption or not, and the constitutionality. Now, we've talked a little bit in the last couple of minutes about the constitutionality. I would have argued in most of our governments that the financial crimes legislation is borderline to begin with. We used to be secure in our papers. Certainly the PNR, there was a great debate over whether, you know, you had freedom of movement or you know, isn't a passport enough. But now the notion that bothers me the most is the thought that the government might put a rootkit on my computer that gets right into my home. And all of this is being done in the name of fighting terrorism, where, at least in Canada, where I come from, we lose far more people to domestic violence than we do to terrorism. I'm not suggesting for a moment that everybody should have a rootkit to check on domestic violence or that we should be bugging homes. But in terms of sort of what I would call constitutional parity, the invasion is remarkable that we are willing to accept in the name of fighting terrorism. So your thoughts on this difference constitutionality, and what's it doing to trust? Are we all becoming like the people who lived under the Stasi, that you're used to, that you expect, even in a so-called democratic society, that you will be surveilled? That's the question.
Well, Stephanie, I hope you won't mind me mentioning as well that Stephanie played a really interesting role in those first crypto wars as a civil servant and working especially at the OECD on setting standards to do with whether people and businesses were using crypto or not. And most governments, in the end, in the mid to late 90s, in those debates at the OECD and elsewhere, decided that the overwhelming benefits to their societies and economies in terms of safety and consumer trust in using online services meant that government should be encouraging the use of encryption, not trying to restrict it or demand backdoors and so on. So I think we'll see at least some of that dynamic again. I'm not completely pessimistic about the involvement of industry in these debates. I think there are a lot of businesses, as Bart and Phil already said, that have a very strong incentive to be reminding governments of that. On the constitutionality side, there was a very good debate in the last panel about what the Court of Justice of the EU data retention decision means for some of these other powers, like the especially travel reporting, PNR databases, where that judgment really is very strong and has brought into question a number of these instruments and their compatibility with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So I think we'll see more on that. Of course, there are also challenges in the national courts of Europe and waiting to go at the European Court of Human Rights on the compatibility of UK law with the European Convention and a number of other countries as well. So, and now that we have had the national decisions largely in the UK, I think the Strasbourg Court will restart that very quickly. So we might also get a decision from them in the next year or two.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to reiterate, begin with Steph's a giant in this field when it comes to the policy of crypto. And it's hard to answer a question she asked other than to put into a form of a question. Which technology are you worried about being rootkitted? Because right now we have the idea that they're going to go after our computers, because that's what we saw in the movies. Fortunately, because of the work of some great advocates, we now know that they're going after telephones. But if industry has the dream that if their dream is realized of the Internet of Things, which sensor is going to be turned on without your knowledge? And is this a sensor that you bought into your own home, or is it a sensor elsewhere? And it's not necessarily a rootkit, it is just a vulnerability that's been found and widely known, but there's no update issued because you bought your fridge and it has this fancy technology on it, and you like using it, but you never bothered to update it. Or maybe your fridge does get an update because the provider is able to push down an update, which means that the provider is then able to push down an update that says, start spying on this home. That's the direction of travel we're going to. So if you think it's bad now, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. Not just because, technology is going everywhere and isn't the world becoming a worse place, but because I don't think we as a society understand, nor do the companies understand, the level of service that we require at a security level when it comes to these new devices and these new sensors and whatnot. And so this is a direction of travel that PI is going to be heading in the next few months, in the next couple of years, we hope, to look at not just the phones and the computers, but the fridges, but not to dumb it down and just say we're looking at the fridges, but the sensors, and who's making sure that these things are actually secure and who's making sure that these things are updated.
I'd like to say something about the Internet of Things also. You know, sometimes I hear it suggested that the Internet of Things have encrypted data channels, you know, so that when they talk to a server, it's encrypted. But it's not enough to just encrypt the data channel, because the problem is the innate behavior of the product is that it's behaving in an evil way, because it was designed to behave in an evil way. It was conceived to act as an agent of the company that made it, not as an agent of the customer. And so, like, there's a TV that of one of the major TV brands that has a camera on it and a microphone, and the camera does face recognition so that each family member would have a different viewing experience. Oh, we're out of time. Oh. But anyway, you could encrypt the channels. You know, it listens to voice commands too, but it uploads them to a server. So it turns your home into North Korea. And you buy it voluntarily. You pay good money for this to turn your home into North Korea. And so you have a TV that is evil in your home, that you introduced into your home and invited in and paid for. So encrypting the channels isn't going to help. We have to figure out a way. I think we need to have public advocacy groups like Privacy International, EPIC, EFF, Center for Democracy and Technology, you know, to try to put together a kind of set of guidelines of behavior for Internet of Things products, of how not to be evil, and to create a seal of approval and then try to use the invisible hand of the market to prefer products that have that kind of seal of approval. We have to get if we're going to go into Internet of Things, we've got to do more than just encrypt the channels. We have to provide market pressure and kind of certification that this is not an evil product. That we don't want to turn our homes into North Korea.
Thank you very much, Phil. I think, unfortunately, we haven't got any more time for questions. I think we're going to have to wrap that up. Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. I certainly will be on the lookout to make sure I don't buy an evil TV. I'm going to leave you with my favourite tweet, actually, from last week on this subject, from Sir Bona Neville Kay, who suggested the message is this: use encryption for obvious security reasons, but also do not use encryption for equally obvious security reasons. So can you join me in thanking our wonderful panel?